Hello and welcome to the inaugural episode of the DigitalEDU Dialogues podcast, a go-to source for administrators, educators, and students to discover the latest emerging trends in education technology, and to learn directly from our industry experts who are on the front lines every single day. I'm your host, Flip Livingstone, marketing and content specialist for Educity. Thank you so much for joining us. Very excited to be here today for the inaugural episode of the DigitalEDU Dialogues podcast. As I said off the top, I'm your host, Flip Livingstone, and on today's kickoff episode, we have an extra special one with special guests, Sheila Fry, COO of the Babb Group, and Instructional Designer and Professor Angela Britcher, joining us to discuss a number of important and hot topics currently circulating the world of education. We're going to discuss the growing concerns around enrollment decline. We know this is the worst enrollment decline we've seen potentially ever on history. We're going to talk about it, why, and what's happening. We're also going to touch on how some schools are actually combating that decline with micro-credential courses, and we'll dive into what they are and how they're better serving students' specific needs, boosting retention, because some schools are actually thriving. I want to pick Angela's brain on that and Sheila's. They're both going to have a lot of interesting sides to this conversation. And we'll also have to dive into perhaps the most important topic circulating in the world of education, and that's accessibility in the classroom and why it's so important to every single student's success, and both to administrators and teachers as well. Sheila and Angela will be on joining us in a very short minute. And joining us now, our very first special guest on the DigitalEDU Dialogues podcast, Angela Britcher, Instructional Designer and Professor on the front lines. This is the woman that you want to hear from, people. Angela, thank you so much for joining us and for being our very first guest.
Thank you, Flip. I'm so excited to be here and to talk about, what's happening in trending in our world of education right now.
And it is rapidly evolving. I think that's one of the main reasons we are going to be a go-to source for educators, administrators, and students to really get in on what's happening. And one of the big things that obviously is at the forefront of headlines, it's at the forefront for schools and for students, is this enrollment decline. It's not exactly a new trend, but we're seeing historically, major numbers around students not returning to the classroom. The pandemic had a big impact on that. What's your take on what's going on right now? Because I know you might have a bit of a different view than some other professors at different schools.
Yeah. So I think a few things are happening. So of course, the pandemic affected in-person enrollment. And I think at this point, with all of the politics around student loan debt, that students are really questioning the return on investment of a four-year degree. So I think that's one of the key pieces to declining enrollment. But this week, the Chloe 8 report came out. This is like a fundamental report we all look for each year. And the respondents are COOs, Chief Online Officers of universities. And what they are finding is that students are enrolling online. And I think that is the trend that we're seeing. So while fewer students may be coming back for that on-campus experience, more students are enrolling online. Another thing that was really interesting out of this report that I see in my classrooms are students who are on campus and are face-to-face students are also enrolling in online classrooms. Like right now, I have a couple of students there in my face-to-face class and an online class.
Interesting.
So for their schedules, they want and need that flexibility. Those, 2 weeks before class starts, so that first week of class when everyone's doing add drop, I will get an influx of emails from advisors, from students. Hey, can I transfer into your online class? Because I need that flexibility, right? They get to the first week of school and they think, oh my gosh, I've got all these classes to manage, my extracurriculars, my job, and they want the flexibility that comes with online. So we're definitely seeing a boom in online, and that was affirmed by the Chloe report. Another thing that I am seeing is that niche schools are really thriving.
Right.
So I think when we look at the big universities, they're having debt issues, and those are the schools that are going to be really impacted, I think, by students making choices around student loans. But niche schools are thriving.
Right.
I work for 3 niche schools, right? So one is STEM focused. They've got their largest online enrollment in their school's history, and they're opening a campus in Dubai.
Wow.
Right? I work for a faith-based school, and they are welcoming back the biggest class since before the pandemic.
Wow.
And they are thrilled, right? And they attract an audience that wants a faith-based education. And I also work for a small business college, and they are hyper-focused on accelerated learning and with career-focused programs. And they also are welcoming back the biggest enrollment since before the pandemic. So I think niche schools are doing really well.
That's amazing, actually. And when, we're going to get to some other topics on today's show, including micro-credential courses. And I think one of the questions that we'll get to is, what is it that these schools are maybe changing and trying to adapt to really combat this enrollment, decline? And I know there's the impact on students, but I guess maybe we should also talk about what's the impact on educators, teachers, professors, administrators themselves. Is there anything that you're seeing on that side of things? Because it's obvious it's impacting students, but how is it maybe impacting, faculty members as well?
So I see 2 things that are happening to faculty. There's either a mass layoff at an institution, right? They're just laying off faculty, they're consolidating programs, they're reducing programs and offerings. So that certainly affects students as well as faculty. But then the faculty that are left at that institution have to take on significantly more responsibilities, a bigger workload, and they have to manage more students. So I think it's a really challenging time for full-time faculty, especially. I think it's a good time to be an adjunct because schools are looking for, adjuncts are cheap labor. You don't need to pay our health insurance, right? We're not full-time employees. So, and we typically work by contract per course per semester. So I think that as we see more layoffs happening, we're going to see more adjuncts working at schools. And I don't know that that's a bad thing. When I think back to my education days, the adjuncts were our favorite professors because they would come from work and teach our class and tell us what happened at work that day. I love that I work in the field of communications every day, and then I get to go and share it with my students. And how many times I walk in and like, here's what happened today. Let's talk about it. And so I think that, but again, it's a really challenging time for faculty as they take on more responsibilities and as they're really concerned about their jobs.
I think there's also that realness factor that you're mentioning. Students these days, you mentioned it, they're working parents, perhaps. They have 2 side jobs. They're trying to make this happen at night or online or in between juggling other things. So when you have a professor like that who's coming right off of, working that day job that they might want to get into, I think there's also that real connection that students need. And, we're talking about retention. That's one of the things students need to adapt, but also administrators, teachers, and, schools also need to adapt. That's what we're going to talk about right around the break. We still have Angela here. We're going to try and bring on another special guest with Miss Sheila Fry, but we got to pay these bills, everybody. And today's episode is brought to you by Professor Services. And here's a message from them.
Today's episode is brought to you by Professor Services. Looking for a job in teaching? Need to expand your network? Want to boost your income? Whatever it is, the expert team at Professor Services has you covered. From helping higher ed faculty find new jobs, to essential tools such as cover letters and CVs, to applying to jobs for you, Professor Services equips you to nail your job search. Don't stress over the job hunt. Maximize your potential and crush your next opportunity with support from our team of experienced administrators, mentors, and educators. Discover how the team at Professor Services can help. Visit professorservices.com today to get started and kickstart your career in higher education.
Thanks again so much for tuning in for the inaugural episode of the DigitalEDU Dialogues podcast. I am your host, Flip Livingstone, here with our very first and special guest, Angela Britcher. We are talking about a number of hot topics in the world of education, and we're going to slide right into our second segment and topic, micro-credential courses. This is one of the things that I've been learning a lot from you directly. And when I read about this, Angela, honestly, I'm a bit removed from my post-secondary education days. But it's this kind of thing and this kind of adaptation that I think really goes such a long way to really helping students first. And I'm really excited to pick your brain about what I think actually more people need to know about these. So very first, micro-credential courses. What are they? What's your take on this? Where'd they come from?
So micro-credentials are this idea that you don't have to take a full degree program, right? You don't need to do a whole master's program or even a whole 2 to 4 year program. The idea is that you get a really super concentrated education experience and get credentialed in that field, whether it's a certificate or some type of professional credential. And I think these are so appealing to modern students because we are busy working adults, right? And we have so much to juggle that making that commitment to a full-time program, it really seems overwhelming. So I think for students, it's a great idea. You get the credential, you get the skills and knowledge you need, and you get to do it relatively quickly. I think the other pieces that are important when we think about micro-credentialing are this trend of upskilling and reskilling, right? As we hear this demand from the government, from schools, from students that they want to graduate job ready. And micro-credential programs are hyper-focused on job ready skills. And so I think when you do a short program, whether it's 4 classes, 6 months worth of classes, whatever that length of time is, that you complete that program and you've got something that is really marketable to add to your resume, to add to your social profile, so you can say, I know how to do this. I have been credentialed in it. So I think it's a real advantage for students.
I honestly, the more that I read into it, I love that it's specifically tailored into learning, to get you into a role, into a profession, at least kickstarting your career path without all the time that I feel some students spend figuring it out over the first year or two of their time at university, college, or otherwise, when really these micro-credential courses could probably be saving a lot of students a lot of time and, more importantly, these days, money. And I guess what I'm curious about is when I read so many benefits, so amazing things that can really directly help students, why aren't we seeing more of these implemented across, really across North America? Is it because it's so new? What is that? I know that's a tough question, but what do you think about why we don't see more of these?
Well, I think that we have to understand that most education institutions are very big ships. And it takes a lot of time and planning to turn a ship, right? So if you are accustomed to being a traditional 4-year degree granting institution, it's a big shift to say we're going to adjust the way that we provide programs. It's a big adjustment for faculty, for staffing, for planning, for income, as well as when you think about the influence that student loan programs have on the income of institutions. So I think all of those things can play a factor in why it's harder for schools to get them started. I think as micro-credential programs grow, that hopefully we'll see more employer-funded programs. One of the schools that I work for has a program, micro-credentialing program, where they partner with employers to provide, the upskill and reskill training. So they focus on things like communication, leadership, management skills. So it's perfect for an employer to say, we want to invest in our employees. And so we are going to pay for them to do this program as a cohort. And this institution is going to either come to us or our students are going to go there and, spend a few months upskilling, reskilling, getting ready for their next job in that organization, right? So the organization is investing in its people, it's investing in itself. And then, the schools obviously benefit. But I think it's a big mindset shift for very large schools and institutions.
When I read about this, personalized learning opportunities, and, we just talked about enrollment issues, do you think maybe rolling out more micro-credential programs could be a good way to maybe combat this enrollment issue and really grow that student retention? Because if I'm thinking about it from myself or a student, or even, going back to school, if a school, if a university or college offered these up, I'm taking a very serious look, because, you mention it in a lot of the blogs you write, being able to balance school, work, and life. This really kind of allows you to do that while still pushing yourself forward. So do you think that could maybe perhaps help fight this enrollment and retention issue?
I do. I think that students are, as we look at students being the target audience, right, for higher ed institutions, that it's kind of like however long ago it was when we all switched from, basic cable, right? You got what the cable company was offering you. And all of a sudden everyone's like, nope, I want on demand. I want what I want when I want it. I want a la carte, right? So thinking about how long that shift took for cable companies to make. And in the meantime, other resources popped up for us, right? And so I think that same thing may happen. And, I think institutions would do well to really listen to their target audience, to students who are saying, we want it faster, we want it cheaper, we want it more personalized, and it needs to be flexible, right? Because we got to do it around work and family and all of our other obligations. But at the same time, from a revenue model, institutions need to do what makes the most sense for them, right? So, are they going to get the revenue they need from offering a whole bunch of micro-credential programs as opposed to offering, 1 year, 2 year, 4 year degree programs and graduate programs? So I think schools have to weigh all of that, and then they have to determine what programs they will offer, right? And so I think all of those are, the big factors that schools have to weigh, but students are definitely interested in micro-credential programs.
One thing that is for sure is that we are going to continue to be your source here at the DigitalEDU Dialogue podcast for all of this information coming out of the world of education all year long. Experts like Angela. We will have our special guest, Sheila Fry of the Babb Group, on right after the break to talk about perhaps one of the most important trending topics in education, and that's accessibility, why it's important to students and educators alike. Thank you so much for joining us for the inaugural episode of the DigitalEDU Dialogues podcast. One more message from our sponsors at the Babb Group, and we'll be right back for our third segment.
This episode of DigitalEDU Dialogues is brought to you by the Babb Group. The demands for teaching and online learning are constantly evolving. Don't get left behind. Carve out a competitive edge and give students engaging learning experiences with support from the Babb Group's team of course design experts. As experienced online faculty and instructional designers, the Babb Group knows how to craft those aha moments for students and meet outcomes for every modality, online, hybrid, and face-to-face, creating engaging, welcoming, and inclusive learning spaces for students of all ages and abilities has never been more important. Discover how the Babb Group can help you by visiting their website today.
And joining us now, our second special guest on the inaugural episode of the DigitalEDU Dialogues podcast. It's Sheila Fry, COO of the Babb Group, here to discuss one of the most important topics right now in education. But Sheila, very firstly, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you taking the time.
Absolutely. Glad to be here. This is kind of a topic that's near and dear to my heart. So I'm glad to talk about it today because I think it's of growing importance in higher education.
Definitely of growing importance, I think, across the spectrum of education. And it's not just, I think, to support students. I think it's also to allow teachers and administrators to provide the best learning experience possible. But I need to ask you first, Sheila, why do you think this has become such an important topic? And I say it's more than a trend now because it is so established. But why do you think there's been this push towards accessibility in the classroom over the last number of years, both online and in person?
Yep. I think that you kind of touched on that a little bit. The touch is because of the growth in online. As you talked about before in your earlier topic about enrollment, this kind of touches on that, where the growth in online has become exponential, and that need then equates to accessibility and education for all. So what does that mean? It kind of means that you need to make sure that your content is accessible, that the diverse types of learning tools are there, just being able to reach everyone no matter what their learning and ability.
And what do you think about that, Angela?
Well, I think that, Sheila used that learning for all. And I think we used to think of accessibility as being for only people that needed it. And now it's this idea that it's helpful to everyone. It's helpful to all learners, as well as, especially in higher ed, students don't have to disclose an accessibility issue to us, right? Mm-hmm. So it's incumbent upon us. To me, it's my ethical responsibility to ensure that I've created all of the resources in a way that everyone can access. I think too, as we've seen, through the pandemic and our K-12 students using a lot more online, that they've become accustomed to those online tools, and several states require accessibility, right? And so as students have gotten accustomed to those tools, all of a sudden they're in the world of online higher ed, and so where did my tools go? So it's whether or not you have an issue that you might need an accessibility tool for, I think it's just become a common usage for our students. And so I think it's our responsibility to provide them.
It's really interesting that you mentioned the responsibility, because I feel there has been that shift from the higher education level for sure that has really now placed this impetus on making sure that courses are accessible. And you mentioned not just for that need to really help all students get the most out of, they're paying a lot of money for these experiences. Let's make sure that they can actually get to where they're going. And, Sheila, I know you have a lot on the go with the Babb group. I know you wear a lot of different hats. There's a lot of different things that you're working on. And I know actually recently you've made a really important hire on the accessibility front to really ensure what we're doing at the Babb group stays fully accessible. I just want to know what's going on with, your side of the things. How does the Babb group support and make sure, all of our clients online have the best possible ability to get their most out of their learning experiences?
That's a really good question. And it all boils down to first, like you said, from the instructional design standpoint, we design accessibility from the get-go, being able to take it just from the initial templates, from the design of the content, how we're going to make those alternate ways to do it. But because of seeing so many of these things and hearing from hiring managers, deans, and leaders that this is gaining importance, that we felt it was important to add someone on our own staff who is going to be able to be a director of accessibility. So this person is able to train organizations on accessibility, to work with them as an extra set of eyes, looking over what we do and create content to say, yes, it is accessible for all people, to make sure we're hitting all these areas. So it was mostly somewhat market demand, but also to make sure that anything that we provide is of high quality to our clients.
It's actually one of those things that I hope more companies and platforms consider in their day-to-day, because this isn't just a fad or some passing trend. It's here to stay, and it's more important than ever that we incorporate it into every single thing that, from an educational standpoint, that we do. And I think really my last question for you both, because we're going to be touching on this topic again, so make sure you continue to tune in, subscribe to the DigitalEDU Dialogues podcast. We will be here as your source for all of this education news that you need. Lastly, when it comes to trends, I keep saying this word, trends, trendy. When it comes to accessible learning and education, is there something that you both have your eye on, something you're hearing about, maybe that next trend that we can expect to be coming out in the near future when it comes to accessible learning? I'll throw it to you first, Angela.
I think that we've got the ideas now, like what we need to do to make videos accessible, to make our resources accessible. I think I might have a little different perspective on it. I think that what we're going to see more of is a demand for compliance. Right. Okay. So we're seeing it. Some states are, requiring their K through 12 programs to be compliant, and that any vendor, any publisher, any textbook that works with them, they have to be compliant in whatever that state's accessibility standards are. And so I am very curious if higher ed will start requiring that, or if states will start requiring it from their higher ed institutions.
Interesting. Sheila?
Yeah. I agree. I'm seeing that as well in some of the requirements and conversations that I have. There's checklists. You have to complete our accessibility checklist to go over all your courses. So making sure it's compliance. I mean, there's always that standard has always been there, universal design for learning, those types of standards that we've always applied. But then that accessibility, that accountability, making sure that what we are doing meets all those standards. But then I wonder, we've heard so much about AI. How is AI going to impact accessibility? Will it help? Will it complicate it? That's kind of yet to be seen. So that's kind of a trend that I think that, maybe it'll help us make our lives easier. That is the unknown.
It's going to continue to develop, and we'll continue to cover all of this news and the hot topics so that you can make sure you have your finger on the pulse from our industry experts. This was the inaugural episode of the DigitalEDU Dialogues podcast. Thank you so much for joining us with our special guests, Angela and Sheila. I have a feeling both of these ladies will be back very soon, so I can continue to pick their expert brains on all the hot topics that you need to know about. Make sure you check us out across all platforms you find your favorite and hottest content. We are free and available on Spotify, Apple, and on YouTube, so make sure you smash that subscribe button as well. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Big Flip Livingstone. Thank you for tuning in.